This is Doxa. We are a weekly gathering of HCFA. So as you can tell, everyone is welcome. You don't have to be a member, and we're just really happy you're all here. So it is every Friday night at 7:30. We have some awesome praise and worship, and then we have great speakers.
Yeah, so kind of our purpose here at Doxa is to connect with one another, to grow spiritually, and to go forth and change our campus with God's love. And to kind of describe the magnitude of God's love, we've called this space Doxa, which means glory in ancient Greek.
Yeah, so we hope you experience some of God's glory and some of God's love tonight and enjoy just this whole gathering. Yeah, and we also hope that specifically tonight, that if you're here and you have a lot of questions or you don't identify as Christian, that you are able to ask those questions and engage and also take something away from the service.
Of course, so we're going to actually welcome up our speaker for the night. But before we do that, we want to give him a proper introduction. So we're going to read out his biography a little bit.
Yeah, he's really accomplished so long. Okay, so Dr. Vince Vitale is a speaker. No, he's really smart, I promise. Okay. Dr. Vince Vitale is a speaker and author who serves as RZIM's regional director for the Americas and director of the Zacharias Institute. He was educated at Princeton University and the University of Oxford, and he taught philosophy of religion. He taught philosophy of religion and served as a faculty member at both universities. It was during his undergraduate studies in philosophy at Princeton that Vince was challenged to read the Bible and took an unexpected journey from skeptic to evangelist. He then completed master's and PhD studies at Oxford, receiving a Daniel M. Sachs graduating scholarship, at the time awarded annually to one Princetonian.
Okay.
And a Claritin scholarship.
Yeah.
Continue.
In addition to that, in addition to his focus on biblical and philosophical questions, he has a strong interest in the topics of leadership, contemporary culture, theology of work, and reconciliation, and as well played in the intersection of faith and sport. He played varsity soccer at Princeton, was a double blue at Oxford, competing for the university in soccer and boxing, and has traveled with Athletes in Action mission teams to 4 continents. While teaching at Princeton, Vince served as the faculty director of the Athletes in Action ministry on campus.
Continued. Vince is married to Dr. Joe Vitale, who is the Dean of Studies of the Zacharias Institute. Joe and Vince enjoy teaming up weekly for the Ask Away podcast, which I listen to, it's sick, and they are overjoyed to be new parents of their son, Raphael.
So everyone here, welcome.
How am I supposed to follow that? I got no time left on the clock after that. Oh, thank you guys. That was unnecessary and honoring. And had a short stint as a boxer, and then got married. My wife told me it's time to take up golf. I wanted to keep boxing, and she wanted me to take up golf, so we did a marriage compromise, and I took up golf. It's great to be here with you guys. It's a real honor. Fetty, thank you. Student leaders, thank you. I've loved getting to know some of you guys. Even we did a training this morning. I had dinner with some of you. I asked one question over dinner. I just asked, hey, did you all expect to wind up in a community like this? Or were you surprised to wind up in a community like this? What was the path that you took to get here? And each person just went around and shared that story. Everyone was incredible. So that's that story of somebody near you at some point tonight. This is a great community, and it really takes me back almost 20 years singing that worship, because my first experience of Christianity was as a freshman at Princeton, being invited along by 2 soccer teammates to a gathering just like this, and walking in and seeing these people that otherwise I thought I could connect with, fellow athletes, just singing their hearts out to this invisible God. And I just thought, either these people are crazy, or there's something deep about reality that I just haven't connected with yet. And that was sort of the beginning of my search. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a little while. But first, tonight, I want to begin with a new and highly scientific argument for the existence of God that I think is going to be very influential in the days ahead. And this is that argument. If there is no God, how come the world fits so perfectly into a chicken? Don't worry, I got some better arguments on the way. But when I got to college, I thought the chicken argument was about as rational as it could get. I didn't think you could give reasons for God. I thought faith was for people who didn't think hard enough. I thought faith had to be blind. I was studying philosophy at the time. I was challenged by 2 soccer teammates to read the Bible for the first time. Wasn't that interested, but was up for a challenge. I began to read through, trying to disprove it, and I would cross things out. I would add things. I'd write a big BS in the margin wherever I disagreed, and Christians would look over my shoulder and say, "Vince, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible?" And I'd say, "Oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study." And that was my starting point. But things changed because I did continue to read through the Bible, wrestling through it. Without realizing it, I began to fall in love with the person of Jesus, the life that he lived, the way that he carried himself, the way that he treated people. And I kept reading. I got to the book of Acts, which is after the stories of Jesus' life, and it's sort of the story of the early church. And I started to come across all sorts of words that I never expected to see in the Bible. Words like reasoning, examining, explaining, disputing, debating, convincing, persuading, even proving. I read that the Bereans, this one people group, it said, were more noble than this other people group. Why? Not because they had blind faith, but because they examined the scriptures daily to determine if what they were being told was true. And I kept reading, and I got to another letter written by the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, and I learned that the first few verses of that chapter are an incredibly early creed that dates to just after Jesus' crucifixion. Some say within months. Even at the conservative estimate, people would say about 2 years, far sooner than any sort of legendary development could have taken place. And as you read through that creed, the earliest creed of Christian beliefs, it goes through all the different people that Jesus had appeared to after he had supposedly risen from the dead. And at one point it says, including more than 500 at once, and in brackets it says, most of whom are still living. Almost as if to say, if you don't believe me, go out and ask them yourself. And I just started to think to myself, how am I to explain that? How am I to explain that very shortly after Jesus died, there were all these people walking around utterly convinced that they had spent time with him? And I actually arranged meetings with the 2 top New Testament professors at the time in the religion department at Princeton. Neither of them were Christians, but they had the expertise. And I thought I'll ask them that question. And I met with them each individually, and I opened up to that passage. And I said, I'm not understanding how to make sense of this. It seems like Jesus' death should have been the end of the movement. Right? He had these followers. They thought he was going to become this earthly king and reign forever, and he died. It should have been movement over. And then all of a sudden you have the eruption of Christianity, one of the greatest movements of all time. How do we fill in that gap? And one of them glanced towards a mass hallucination theory. And it's a theory that is really riddled with problems. It hasn't earned any degree of credibility in the literature, partly because it's not that there was just one mass hallucination. The claim is that Jesus appeared to individuals in different places, to groups, small groups, large groups, in different regions, both to friends and to enemies. I met with the other professor, and he told me that as a historian, he said, I'm simply not interested in the question. And there seemed to be this assumption that as soon as we begin to entertain the miraculous, we're no longer talking about history. And I've never been able to understand why he thought he could make that assumption at the beginning, at the forefront, rather than seeking through the evidence and seeing where it led. So I was encountering all of these things, and these people, they weren't believers that I was meeting with, but they weren't able to give me an alternative to Jesus' actual resurrection to make sense of the history that I was seeing. And I kept reading, and I went further in the New Testament. I came to the book of Hebrews, and for the first time I came across an actual biblical definition of faith. And it said, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And this was just not at all what what I was expecting. And I thought to myself, this doesn't sound like a God who's asking me to take some blind leap of faith. Far from it. It doesn't sound like a God who's just asking me to love him with my heart, my soul, and my strength, but also with my mind. And as somebody that was studying philosophy and the life of the mind was very important to me, that was very significant. And I can remember thinking to myself that if God made me, and if he had made me with this mind, then he would want a sincere intellectual search to at least point in his direction. And ultimately, that is what I found. I continued to seek these things out intellectually. I opened my heart in different ways to whether this could be true, and eventually I did wind up becoming a Christian. But back up a bit, my story began with two soccer teammates who challenged me to read the Bible. I've always been a lover of sports, but I want to give you sort of an analogy and then make a few points out of it. Here's a sporting experience I would never want to have. Imagine if you were thrown into a game and you were supposed to be playing in this game, and you didn't know when the game had started, when it is going to finish. You didn't know what the objective of the game is, and you didn't know any of the rules. Okay, you'd be in trouble. You might ask the players next to you those 4 questions. What if they gave you all different answers? Okay, you might try to find a coach on the sideline. Give me definitive answers to those questions. And he's just saying, keep going, you're all doing great. Okay? And then you try to find a referee to finally resolve these questions, and you find out that the players didn't like his calls. They had sent him home. And my point is that it is our knowledge of the start, the finish, the objective, and the rules of a game that allow us the freedom to play it in a meaningful way. If you don't have answers to those 4 questions, then all you can do on the field is pretend and hope no one realizes that you have no idea what you're doing. And I think that's not just a game, but that's also real life, right? A lot of people, maybe some of us, were walking around without answers to the same exact 4 questions. Questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. The start, where do we come from? The finish, where are we headed? The objective, what's the purpose of life? And the rules, how should we live? Okay, 4 fundamental questions of life. And I just find it interesting that when I give the analogy, the sports analogy, it's immediately obvious to all of us, which is why we laugh, that of course you can't engage meaningfully in the game if you don't have answers to those 4 questions. Well, then the question arises, how can we engage meaningfully in life if we don't have answers to the same 4 questions? So those were 4 of the questions that I was thinking through as I was considering these issues of faith for the first time. And I just want to share a couple of reflections on each one of those 4 categories. I'll start with origin. Where did we all come from? Why is there this enormous, intricate universe at all? And my initial assumption was that Christianity, or the faith position, offered the crazy answer to that question, and science offered the sober, sensible, reasonable answer to that question. There was a specific conversation that began to change my mind about that. I was emailing back and forth with a friend of mine, an emeritus professor at Princeton, retired professor, and at this point, I had become a Christian. He was not. We were emailing back and forth about some of the reasons. He had written me an email with a long list of his objections to Christian faith. And then at the end of the email, the very last line, he just wrote, "Nor can I believe in a virgin birth." And it was sort of as if to say, this trumps all the other arguments. It would simply be a crazy thing to believe in something like that. And I started to think about it. I began to draft an email back. I began to try to write, maybe hoping to persuade him that maybe he could at least consider believing in a virgin birth. And then it sort of dawned on me, maybe he already does. In fact, maybe all of us believe in a virgin birth of one sort or another. Let me explain that. Christians believe in the virgin birth of Jesus, that God came and was born of a virgin. Look, as a Christian, I'm willing to just put my hand up and say, wow, that's an extraordinary, incredible claim to make. But what is the alternative? I want you to consider the brilliant Cambridge physicist Stephen Hawking, his attempt to propose an atheistic birth of our universe. Okay, so here's what he says. He says, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. And I started to think to myself, like, is that any less miraculous than Jesus being born of a virgin? That sounds a lot like a virgin birth as well. Or, my field is philosophy of religion. Consider the position of the philosopher of religion, Quentin Smith, a serious academic, 12 books, over 150 peer-reviewed articles to his name. And here's his position. He says, the fact of the matter is that the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. We should acknowledge our foundation in nothingness and feel awe at the marvelous fact that we have a chance to participate briefly in this incredible sunburst that interrupts, without reason, the reign of non-being. And again, I thought to myself, that sounds a lot like a virgin birth as well. And at least I came to the conclusion that we live in a miraculous world. Whether you are a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic, I don't think there's any getting around that fact. I think one way or another, every one of us is committed to believing something extraordinary. Maybe it's not a matter of whether we believe in a virgin birth. Maybe it's more just a matter of which virgin birth we choose to accept. One option is to choose the virgin birth of an atheistic universe, a universe which ultimately is blind and indifferent to us. Another option is to choose the virgin birth of Jesus, of God, someone who's not blind and indifferent to us. Okay, somebody who loves us fully, who knows us fully, who calls us sons and daughters, friends and family. It's actually the exact opposite of blind indifference. Someone who's not blind to anything about you, someone who knows you in absolute full and yet loves you in full. That became an idea that became increasingly attractive to me as I realized it wasn't the crazy option and the non-crazy option, but actually all of the options are quite extraordinary because we just do live in a miraculous universe. That's just a reflection about origin, and we can talk more about it during the Q&A later if you like. Next, let me say something about morality. I think most of us, in one form or another, we believe in morality. We believe that some things are good and some things are evil, some things are right and some things are wrong. We believe that all people should be treated with dignity and fairness and respect. At the foundation of this morality that I think we're all grasping for is the belief that all people are equally valuable. But then I think that raises a really interesting question. If all people are equally valuable, doesn't there have to be something which is equally true of every single person, in virtue of which every person is equally valuable? And so what is it? What is the thing that's equally true of every single one of us and therefore allows us to be equally valuable and that be the foundation of any plausible morality? Well, it's not easy to answer that question. All of our natural endowments are distributed along a spectrum. Some of us are more intelligent than others. Some of us are stronger than others. Some of us are more capable of passing on our genes than others. What is it that's equally true of every single person? It's not an easy question to answer, but I came to believe that within a Christian understanding of the world, one answer to that question could be the love of God. Okay, in particular, the love of the Christian God, which is a unique type of love. It's a love which is completely unconditional. It's a no-ifs love. It's an extravagant love. It's not a love you can earn, and it's not a love that you could do anything to lose. So therefore, it's completely constant for every single person throughout all time and can ground that equal value of every single person. Christians call that idea grace, unmerited love. The philosopher Robert Adams puts it this way. He says, grace is a disposition to love which is not dependent on the merit of the person loved. A gracious person sees what is valuable in the person he loves and does not worry about whether it's more or less valuable than what could be found in someone else he might have loved. Early in our dating relationship, my now wife, Jo, at one point she turned to me and she said, Vince, I don't deserve you. And I think she was fishing for a few compliments. And so she was surprised when I turned to her and I said, no, you don't. Which is not recommended. But thankfully I didn't stop there. I said, no, you don't, and I don't deserve you either. Isn't it wonderful? You know, how could you ever... how could we ever deserve another person as our very own? And surely that's beyond what anyone could deserve. Love at its best, I think, is not based on what we earn, merit, or deserve. It's based on grace. And I like that type of love. It's the sort of love which means you don't always have to be looking over your shoulder or around the corner worrying that somebody more worthy of love than you is going to come along. It's the sort of love that means you can stop competing to be loved and just rest in the enjoyment of it. It's a love that is secure. And so it's a question for us. Just what if that's true? What if it's true that even before the foundation of the world, there is a God who actually exists and who loved each one of us in that unconditional, extravagant way, with a love that cannot be earned and also cannot be lost, with a love that is exactly the same on your best day and on your very worst day, with the love of a newborn, of a new parent that looks down at a newborn child. And that child, we have our first son now, 9 months old. You can't do anything to earn the parent's love, and yet that love could not be more extravagant. I mean, Jesus told a story about God's love, and he told this story of this son who demanded his inheritance early. Some of you will know the story, some of you won't, but it's a remarkable story. It's a son who did everything wrong. He got everything wrong. He demanded his inheritance early in that culture that was basically to wish your father dead. And he runs off. He wastes the inheritance on everything you're not supposed to spend it on. He winds up broke. He's eating with the pigs. Finally thinks, I'll go back and see if I can get a job from my father. And as he's heading back, it says, when the father sees him still far off, it says, he just takes off running towards his son. He would have hiked up his robe in that Middle Eastern culture, exposed his legs in a shameful way, and took off running towards his son. I've always thought about this story from the other perspective, like what the son must have thought as he saw his father. He had done everything wrong, and he saw his father sprinting towards him from afar. He probably thought he was going to get hit. I mean, he knew. He probably did. He probably did. And he knew what should have happened to him in that culture, in that cultural context. What should have happened was that he should have stood in the middle of the village, and the village should have circled around him, and they should have yelled at him, "You are cut off from your people," because he had lost his inheritance to foreigners. And instead, his father sprints to his son and throws himself on him and kisses him and embraces him and gives him the best robe, would have been the father's own robe, gives him a ring on his finger, the authority to act on behalf of the family again, gives him sandals on his feet, yells back to the family and says, "Kill the best animal that we have, we're throwing the biggest party that you've ever seen." That's the way that Jesus characterizes the love of God. It's a love that's not meant to be earned, simply a love that's meant to be returned. That we are loved by God, I suggest, is the one and only thing about us that could never change. That's why the love of God can give us our identity, and that's why the love of God can ground the equal value of every single person, which is at the foundation of any plausible morality. Origin, morality. Let me say something about meaning. People have enough to live by, but nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. In words by Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor in 1946, still true today. What is the meaning of life? What does it mean for something to have meaning? Does this collection of letters have meaning? Well, it depends. It depends on whether someone intentionally put those letters side by side in order to communicate something, or whether that's just a random collection of letters. I thought that my son Raphael's first word was Dada. Now, Joe reminded me at this point that he was only 7.5 months old, but I was like, well, he clearly said Dada. He's a Vitale. He's advanced. Clearly what he said. And then my brother walked into the room and he said, Dada, Dada. Then a cockroach walked into the room, as they do in Georgia, and he said, "Da, da, da, da." And then I was no longer proud. My point is, randomness is the enemy of meaning. Even if something appears to have meaning, it might not if it was not intentional. Even when something looks meaningful, it's only actually meaningful when it is the intention of an intelligent being. So a question that I want to ask is, was our universe intended? And I think that over the last 35 years or so, science and developments in cosmology has strongly suggested that it was. Here's how. The universe that we live in could have taken many different forms. And scientists have approached a consensus, not just Christian scientists, but scientists in general, that there are dozens of fundamental features of the universe that needed to be precisely the way that they are in order for life to be possible. Not just life on the planet Earth, not just life as we know it, but any form of life anywhere in the universe. Take just one example. The explosive force of the initial expansion of the universe had to be within 1 part in 10 to the 60th of what it actually was in order for life to be possible. The percentage difference of 0 followed by a period, followed by 57 zeros, followed by a 1. If that initial expansion is just the slightest bit weaker, gravity has the universe collapse back in on itself almost immediately, far too quickly for any form of life to develop. If the expansion is just the slightest bit stronger, the universe literally disperses into thin air. Particles wind up so far from each other so quickly that all you could have gotten would have been cold, simple molecules, nothing like the sort of complex chemistry required for any form of life. Sir Roger Penrose, emeritus professor at Oxford, one of the world's leading mathematical physicists, he estimates that the overall difference you could have, if you took not just one of these variables, but all of them combined, the overall difference you could have while still accommodating life is less than 1 part in 10 to the power of 10, raised and turned again to the power of 123. As you guys are laughing, you know that that is a ridiculous number. I couldn't write that number out for you as a percentage, because even if I could change all the matter in the universe into paper, I would have far too little paper to print the required number of zeros. I would need more zeros than there are particles in the universe. Sir Fred Hoyle, the late Cambridge astronomer, one of the 20th century's most significant scientific thinkers, he compared the random emergence of even the simplest cell, let alone human life, but even the simplest cell, to the likelihood, if it was just based on chance, he compared it to the likelihood of a tornado blowing through a junkyard and just happening to produce a perfect Boeing 747 airplane. Those are the sorts of odds that we're talking about. Incredible precision. And so it at least raises some questions that we need to consider. What could have been there way back at the beginning in order to set the parameters at that time? What would be powerful enough to fling the galaxies across the sky? What would be smart enough to know precisely how to set those parameters? And perhaps also what would be relational enough or loving enough to desire not just any form of life, but human form of life, the sort of life which is capable of entering into relationship. The Bible says that we are words, not just random collections of letters, but words. It actually claims that we are poems. It uses the Greek word poema, where we get the English word poem from. And it uses that word to refer to only 2 things. One is the natural world. It says that God's creation is his poem. And then in another place, it says that we are God's handiwork. Another translation reads, we are God's masterpiece. That's Ephesians 2. And it's the same word, poema, poem. So I think that this is an important question. Are we a random collection of genetic letters? Or are we a poem that has been intentionally and carefully and intimately crafted by God himself? Are you a Sestina? I think that is one of the questions behind the question of the meaning of life. Origin, morality, meaning, just a basic reflection on each. Let me say finally something about destiny. Where are we headed? Are we headed anywhere? I saw a commercial a while back, a sort of an odd commercial, but it depicted a baby being born. And then throughout the next 30 seconds, this child flew through the air. And as it did, it went through each stage of the development of life. So first an infant, and then a toddler, and an adolescent, and an adult, and then began to get older, and then came into a later stage of life and began to be hunched over, and the hair went gray, and then at the end of the commercial came down out of the sky and crashed into a grave dead. And then the screen went black, and these words appeared across the screen. And I responded like you did, you know. I laughed really hard. I was like, that's really funny. But then I also caught myself, right? Because I also caught myself and I thought, that's also devastating. Like, really? Is that really the best that we've got? Life is short? Play more Xbox? Is that the best that we've got? Life is short, it's full of injustice and brokenness, but there's nothing you can do about it, so just try to distract yourself, try to find some ways to entertain yourself, try to find some coping mechanisms. You know, is that the best we've got when someone commits suicide, when we lose a loved one, when someone's so lonely that it's hurt? Is that really the best that we've got? I believe that Jesus, in the context of the Christian way of thinking about the world, offers such a better hope. I want to read you these words from a friend of mine. He once said, if the resurrection is true, if Jesus really rose from the dead, then what that means for you is that if it comes to a point in your life where it seems like there is no hope, if it comes to a point in your life where it seems like even death is inevitable and there's no way to escape it, well, death is not the end. There's more. There's hope, no matter what. And those are words of a dear friend and colleague of ours named Nabil Qureshi. We lost him to cancer 2 years ago at the age of 34. But he remained very convinced of those words to his last breath, because he truly believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And if he believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, then he truly believed that he would rise from the dead as well, and that his last breath on this earth was not, in fact, his last breath. And I believe that I will see Nabil again. That's a source of great hope for me. I believe I'll see him in a place where there'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. I believe that Jesus has gone to prepare a place for him and for us. And Jesus says, I've gone to prepare a place in my Father's house, which has many rooms. And as I was first preparing the content for this talk, I started to think about that. And Nabil, we both lived in Oxford, England for a while. And when we did, he and his wife and then his daughter lived in the same apartment building as us. There were 8 apartments in the building, and they lived 2 floors below, directly below us. And for 2 years, we loved, walking by and seeing them on the way in and seeing them on the way out. And as I began to reflect on this, I just began to smile at the thought that maybe one day soon, Nabil will again live just 2 floors below. Not in some symbolic, metaphorical sense, but literally in the same structure, in the same house. For me, that is how real and concrete and tangible the hope of Jesus is. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. I know I haven't given you full persuasive arguments on each one of those, but I hope I've just opened up enough to have some conversation about it. But there's just one more thing that I want to end on. I believe that Christianity offers compelling responses to those fundamental questions of life. But the remaining question, and the really important question, is, do we have reason to trust the one who's giving the answers? If you don't have reason to trust the one who's giving the answers, then that's not much good. I want to tell you my favorite story, my most vivid memory from my childhood, hopefully as a way to begin to answer that question. I was about 6 years old or so, and I was out playing football on my next door neighbor's front lawn, and I was playing with some older kids, and I was getting knocked around pretty good, and I started crying. And I came running home to my mom, who was standing on the front porch, and I was crying, and I was saying, I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough. And so I ran up to Mom saying that, and there's Mom depicted there, sporting the classic 80s onesie. And I'm saying, I'm not tough enough, I'm not tough enough. So what does my mom do? Well, Mom did what any loving mother of a 6-year-old son would do. She positioned herself like this. She got down in quite an athletic stance. And she looked at me lovingly. And she hung her nose out in the air. And then she said to me, punch me in the nose. She said, you are tough enough. Punch me in the nose. Well, this doesn't happen in your family? and crazy Italians. And I did. I just looked at her like she was crazy. And indeed, she was. But she persisted. She said, punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose. I'm not recommending this. But finally, I guess this is where the boxing career started. Finally, I actually did. I don't know what sort of psychological state I must have been in, but I reared back. I gave my mom a straight right hand to the nose, and to my astonishment and to her astonishment, blood actually began to drip out of my mom's nose and down her face. Stay with me. But then came just one of the most memorable, but also one of the most gorgeous images from my childhood. Through this blood that was coming down my mom's face, through it, it just came the most dazzling, radiant, joyful smile. And my mom said, "Now get back out there." I went back to the game, and she went inside to get cleaned up. You might not know what to make of that story. Okay, understandably so. What an unthinkable thing for my mom to do. What a messy thing for her to do. What a bloody thing for her to do. But I also think, in at least one sense, what also an extravagant display of love. I mean, my mom chose to bring me into this world. And when she did that, she knew that there would be challenges. She knew there would be frustrations. She knew there would be trouble. She knew there would be suffering. But she was trustworthy. I trusted her above all. Why? Because when those challenges came, when my eyes filled with tears, she bent down into that suffering with me, even though that meant suffering at the hands of her own child. And that, for me, is an imperfect but deep picture of what Jesus did on the cross, where God did not stay far off on some heavenly throne, distant from the suffering of those that he had created, but he came down into this world so that anything that we go through, we would know that he's been through it too. He bent down into that suffering with us. Was it unthinkable? Yes. Was it messy? Yes. Was it pretty? Yes. But I also think that it was an extravagant display of love, even though that meant his own suffering, even though that meant suffering at the hands of those that he had created. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. I think that the Christian faith gives compelling responses to those questions, but the ultimate question, I think, is can we trust the one who's giving the responses? And to me, the deepest way you can know if someone loves you is if they're willing to suffer alongside you, if they're willing to bleed with you and for you, if they're willing to give their life for you. And that is the centerpiece of the Christian story. A God who doesn't just have clever answers to questions, but who loved you so much that he was willing to give his life for you. So I'll leave it there at the moment, and we're excited to hear your questions. We love questions. We think that's a sign of faith, not a sign of lack of faith. So I'm excited for Casey to join me. Maybe the MCs want to come and bring him up. And thank you guys for tracking with me. Thanks for laughing at most of my jokes. I appreciate that as well. Casey's bio better be as long as mine.
Yeah, so we're going to enter into a time of Q&A like we said, but of course Casey here is going to be helping out with this Q&A, so we want to give him a proper introduction as well. Casey Leander is a fellow with the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, or the OCCA. And prior to his time at the OCCA, he earned a degree in history and PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics from Taylor University. He worked briefly in politics, serving as an intern in the U.S. Senate in Washington, D.C.
As an OCCA fellow, Casey speaks widely on the philosophical underpinnings of popular culture, the need for God and moral reasoning, and the historical credibility of the Christian message. Casey originally hails from Colorado Springs, Colorado, and harbors a love of mountains, food trucks, and spectacular views. Please welcome up Casey and Benjamin.
So the way we're going to do this, if you could put up the slide right there.
Okay, maybe the slide is not coming up. But here's what you guys want to do. Take out your phones, right? And you want to type in sli.do. Right, and that's going to come up with a home page. Again, that's sli.do. That's all you need to type in your browser, right? And right at that home page is going to say enter an event code. And just to let you guys know, that event code is U932. So that's sli.do, and the event code is U932. Okay? And you guys can just type out your questions from there, and then we'll ask some of the guys up here.
Yeah, my goal is to make this as noisy as possible. I'll just say that before Vince told the story of him punching his mom, I was going to get up here and introduce myself by saying I could take Vince in a boxing match any day of the week. But now I'm not going to say that because this is a hard dude. I took a tiny little bite out of 3 different majors. Yeah.
Yeah, and they all are anonymous. So, yeah. You guys are fast. You're already asking questions. I don't know if you're going to display it up here. If you want us to wait until it's displayed up here, Fetty, or if you want us to just watch it. Okay, the top-rated question is this: how can we know that the Christian God is real as opposed to the Islamic God or some other God? I'll take a shot at this, Vince, and then you can dive in on that. That is a great question, and that, in fact, that is the question that we need to ask as human beings. I think the fundamental answer, to get there, we almost have to ask another question. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I think the fundamental question we have to ask is, what is wrong with the world? If we're going to know who God is, so I think it's creation. From creation, we know that it's obvious that this isn't an accident, and we can sort of arrive at that conclusion via general revelation, like Vince is talking about. There's specificity, there's order. We know that there's purpose to the universe, and people disagree on that, but that type of thing is available to us as evidence, whether or not we've read any of the sacred texts of any religions, right? But then the next question after that is, okay, maybe there is some supreme being. What's this being like? And so we get into what we essentially have to do is compare ideas about God. And one angle that I think I've taken on this, in the sort of comparative analysis of religions, is to ask, what do each of these religions teach is wrong with the world? Because that informs what our solution is to the world. And I'm struck by this idea, and I'll just throw this out maybe as one angle of thinking about this topic, but we're all aware that there's this justice, this idea of justice in the world. And justice, by its definition, is mandatory.
You can't look at something truly unjust and walk away and say, it's cool that that keeps going, right? Or it's cool that that goes unpunished. Vince and I have a colleague who lives in northern Nigeria. In his line of work, he's a pastor. He's also an investigative journalist. And what he has actually done in northern Nigeria is he's done investigative journalism on trafficking that was being conducted by people within the government. And he traced the movements of traffickers and brought this to light. And when you hear him talk about that experience and the types of things he had to do and the types of settings he was in, as he followed up this information, it's like the injustice of some of these situations just makes your skin crawl. So justice is mandatory. And I think we can agree that justice is mandatory. But here's the question. If there's a God who demands perfect justice, how are we to solve that problem? And this is where I actually think Christianity stands in radical. It stands apart from other ways of answering that question, because I actually think any other way of answering the question falls short. We have a few options. How do we deal with perfect justice? Well, we can just do our best to do the right thing, from here on out. But that doesn't answer perfect justice, right? We can sort of ignore the faults. We can pretend that like bad things haven't happened and that there isn't justice that needs to happen, but that doesn't solve it. I genuinely think if there is a God and he's the standard of perfection and of perfect justice, then we have one option to be reconciled to him. We need him to forgive us. Right? And that's what's at the core of the Christian message. So I guess that's a philosophical way of looking at this. And there's so much more to be said. I don't know, Vince, maybe you want to add on.
Sure, no, that's really helpful. And I would say for me in my own journey, the historical piece was very significant. I thought if there is an all-loving God who wants to communicate with us, and if he wanted to communicate with us, he would do so in such a way that we can actually look into it, we could actually use it online, that there would be evidence for it. And when I looked into the historicity surrounding resurrection, I was blown away by what I found. I wish I had time to share more of that today, but one of my former colleagues at Oxford, this is a guy who, his name's Richard Splendor, who's probably the most influential British philosopher of religion for the last 60 years or so. In 2003, he wrote a book called The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And in that book, he argues that on the available evidence today, it's 97% probable that Jesus truly, physically, miraculously rose from the dead. Now, you might laugh at the idea of putting a percentage to that. He's not asking us to take the number very seriously. He likes to work with probability theory, so he plugs in guesstimates at each point in his argument. But nevertheless, just the fact that somebody of his academic stature, who held the head post in philosophy of religion at Oxford for many years, can have that argument published by Oxford University Press and then ably defend it at academic conferences around the world, which I've seen him do. I mean, that just blew my mind. I just thought there's no way you could even look into the veracity of some historical event which maybe or maybe didn't happen 2,000 years ago. When I looked into it, I was blown away. And I would say if you haven't yet, I would really encourage you to do so. Whether you're a Christian or not, that's something that's going to be very encouraging to your faith. But one other thing I would say in terms of a differentiation between different conceptions of God is the way I spoke about the love of the Christian God is distinctive about the Christian God. My friend Nabil, who I quoted earlier, part of his journey to faith from an Islamic background was partly in realizing that in his Islamic framework, God loved him if he was obedient or if he believed the right things. And he began to think that through, and he thought, actually, that's not the way that my human father even loves me. My human father would continue to love me even if I was disobedient. He would continue to love me even if I didn't believe the right things. And he said, it can't be the case that the all-perfect God loves me in a way which is sufficient relative to the love of my human father. God's love must be greater than that, and he found an unconditional love in the love of the Christian God. I think it was, at least when I saw the second most voted on question, which was about, sorry, you want to use the mic? Thank you. The second most voted question was, why do we suffer if God loves us? So again, huge question that we could spend all night on, but let us just give you some things to think about. The first time I ever tried to answer that question as a Christian was with my Aunt Regina. She spoke with me about some suffering that was happening in her son's life, my cousin. And I listened to her, and then I began spouting my philosophical explanations for why God might allow suffering and evil in the world. And she listened very patiently, and then she turned to me and she said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." So I've always been hesitant to answer this question in a short manner, knowing that even when asked in a philosophical way, it can be a very personal question. So please take what I'm saying as just one thing to begin to think about in a much bigger question. But something which has been significant in my own thought is to realize that sometimes we think of the problem of suffering like this. We picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering. Then we picture ourselves in a very different world with far less suffering or no suffering. And then we think to ourselves, well, surely God should have made me and the people that I love in this other world, in this very different world with much less suffering or with no suffering. But I think that one question we forget to ask is, would it still be you and me and the people that we love and all the people that we see walking around campus if in fact God had radically done something different to the world such that it looked like that and not like this? And sometimes I tell another story about my family, which I think you guys will appreciate. This was my parents' second date, and they were standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, and my dad noticed a ring on my mom's finger. So he asked about it, and she said, "Oh, that's just some ring one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice." My dad said, "Oh yeah, it does look nice. Let me see it." So she took it off and she gave it to my dad. And the great thing is, my wife is British, and so I spent a decade in England, and I tell this story in England, and we get to this point in the story, no one has any idea what's about to happen. They're just so reserved that they can't imagine that anyone would do this, right? But everyone here knows exactly what my dad's about to do. And he throws the ring off the bridge, and he walks and sinks to the bottom of the East River, and he says, "You're with me now." You won't be needing that anymore. Can't get this crowd back. Now, my mom loved it. That was like the clinching moment for them. But, however, what if she hadn't? What if she had thought, this guy's a bit nuts, I better run off with the old boyfriend instead? What would that have meant for me? Now, I might be tempted to think, oh, maybe I would have been better off. Maybe, the old boyfriend was taller, maybe he was better looking, maybe he was more athletic, maybe he was royalty. That'd been great. I could have lived in a castle. But of course, I'm not thinking about it in the right way, because if my mom had wound up with the old boyfriend rather than with my dad, maybe a really nice kid would have been born and maybe he would have been royalty, but I don't think it would have been me. Right? Part of what it is to be me is to be born into the circumstances I was born into, including having the parents that I have. My point is this: just the throwing of a ring, a specific instance like that, can have a real bearing on who comes to exist. Could it be the case that when we unwittingly sort of wish for this other universe without any suffering, with far less suffering, that we wish that God had made or that God had allowed to exist, we're doing so assuming that we would be there, assuming that our loved ones would be there? Maybe that's a complicated question. And if it's the case, as the Christian faith says, that God actually desired you, he wanted you specifically to come into existence because he wanted to invite you specifically into a relationship with him, then could it be the case that one of the reasons the world looks the way it does is because it's the sort of world that allowed for you to come to exist? Now, I'm not saying that's the end of the story, and once you do come to exist, you can be transferred into a very different existence at some point, an existence where there will be no more suffering or mourning or crying or pain. And if we were going to be stuck in just this existence for all eternity, then without any option otherwise, maybe God wouldn't have made that choice. But maybe he would if he could get you to come to exist. You wouldn't have existed otherwise, and you have an option of being with him for all eternity. That's just one thing to think about in response to this question. There's so much more to say.
Yeah, your family's crazy, Vince.
Thanks, bro.
Your next book should be called Growing Up Italian. You go into depth. I love that point, and and just thinking about suffering too. Maybe that I point, and I only say this because it relates to what we were talking about a second ago with justice and with perfect justice. I think about if that is the case, right? And this was your doctoral dissertation too on that exact theme, that maybe this is how it had to be for you and I to even be here. And if that is the case, and God wants us to be ushered into a place where he makes it right at the end of time. You know, because if God is about perfect justice, then there has to be a time when he comes back and he says, you know what? Suffering, pain, it ends right now. But he's got to do something about us. Because if we're honest with ourselves, we're the ones inflicting that suffering, at least some of the time. We're all victims and we're all perpetrators of suffering. There's a quote by a guy named Walter Brueggemann, and it says this: the misery and splendor of the human life fit no simplistic explanation. The misery and the splendor of the human life fit no simplistic explanation. And so it seems to me that if there is a perfect God and he's going to make things right, we need to have a way of not being on the losing side of that equation. So almost God allowing the suffering to persist is him allowing this medium ground for us to make a choice in response to that. And I think that's what you see with the Christian God. I think that's exactly why the world we live in, along with all of its pain, persists, is because God desires that none should perish, but that all should be, that all should come into a knowledge of him and be saved. Right?
Yeah, great. Yeah, this is probably going to have to be the last question, but again, we're going to have a system of getting your questions answered like sometime in the next week. But this will be the last one we do up here.
Okay, great. And let us say, too, we like to be the last ones in the room, so I think there's like a social hour after this as well. We'll stick around until nobody's left, so any questions that are out there, if people want to talk, we'd love to, so we'll be around. Do you have one that you wanted to jump in on?
You called.
All right. I'll ask it and you answer.
Cool. Yeah, great.
and then I'll say something to finish the evening. How literally do you take parts of, this is the top voted question at the moment, how literally do you take parts of the Bible that contradict science? For example, Noah's flood.
Yes, so good. Okay. That is so good. Look, when you read the Bible, you're reading a book compiled by 66 different authors over thousands of years of human history from different cultures. And so I think the first thing we have to do is approach the Bible asking the question, what did the authors intend to communicate when they wrote this? Okay? That's called exegesis. It's the study of taking texts in the manner in which they were meant to be interpreted, starting there, and then letting that meaning inform our response to it. So if we do bad exegesis, we come to bad conclusions. For example, in one of the books of the Bible, Song of Solomon, the poet is comparing a beautiful woman, and he says, your neck is like a tower, and your hair is like a flock of doves. You know, so if we were like, wow, the Bible is a freaky, weird book, right? How it's so fake. It's talking about people whose necks are towers. You know, like I can't believe that, you know. So I think the first thing you have to ask is, what is the Bible intending to commit? Now, to say about these things. Now, I don't deny that there actually are some spectacular things written in Scripture. And I would want to push back on some of the assumptive language that's like, well, obviously a flood didn't happen. I would actually want to push back on that. I hear things like that, and I just want to say, what evidence have you seen that's convinced you that something like that didn't happen? Okay, and that might just be a starting question to ask. I think sometimes we go into these conversations with our own deeply ingrained cultural assumptions. For example, that supernatural things never happen or are impossible. Now look, I'll be the first to say that if supernatural things do happen, they have to be rare. You know, I don't know if I've ever seen anything supernatural happen, but I would also have to say that that's a philosophical predisposition against some form of divine intervention. It's a philosophical, it's an a priori assumption you bring into that conversation. So, now as it relates to scientific, I'll just land it on this, that I think our understanding of science and our understanding of Scripture both need good, thoughtful approaches. And by that I mean that science is not itself an authority on anything. Science is a means by which we gather data. Right? It's human beings who make theories, hypotheses based on that data, but science itself cannot make conclusions based on the data it gathers. And I think, and you guys will know this, right, as you press further into your experience in higher education, that the more you know, actually, the more you find out you don't know. I heard a quote recently that, and it goes like this: the confidence of the amateur is the envy of the professional. That's good. Hold on to that one, because you guys are all going to be professionals at something, right, in the near future. So I just think it's important for us to say, okay, look, science does have some limitations. It's not some infallible. And if you want a more concrete example, look at the smoking ads in like the 1950s. There's guys with a stethoscope around their neck and a lab coat on, and they're like, Camels, they soothe your throat. I recommend at least 5 packs a day. It's like, okay, well, science might have actually, we might have drawn down different conclusions from the data we have in science. So science is fluid and it's flexible. And I know that's not a specific answer to the flood question. If you want to deep dive on the flood, come find me afterwards and we'll talk about some of this stuff. But in terms of just a philosophical framework by which we approach these questions, I think it's important to just to have an accurate and appropriate understanding of what science is, and when we need good exegesis of what Scripture is trying to say.
Yeah, great. And I only encourage you that there's so much more to say, but it is perfectly possible to love God and be a person of faith, and to love science and love the exploration of science. And sometimes we think those things are incompatible, but whatever the newest discovery in science that comes out of Harvard is going to be, and I'm going to read it in the newspaper, I'm going to rejoice at that. I'm not going to think like, oh no, something got taken up by science and now no longer God gets credit for it. No, I think if God does exist, I think my God is a good engineer. And so I think he created things in such a way that they would function in a way that has processes to it and that we could explore it. He'd want us to investigate that and to discover things. And so you can really hold those two things together in a beautiful way. I actually think the regularity of the universe is potentially a clue to God's existence. We don't think about these sorts of questions often, but why does gravity have the same strength today that it did yesterday, and why can we be confident it's going to have the same strength tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that and the day after that? I mean, logically, philosophically, there's all sorts of different strengths it could take. Why does it take the same exact strength yesterday, today, and every day into the future? It's not clear to me why that's the case on just a natural view of the world. But if there's a God who wants there to be regularity to the world because he wants us to be able to comprehend it, and he wants us to find meaning in it, and he wants us to be able to explore it, maybe that's one explanation of the regularity that actually underlies the entire scientific enterprise. We can really hold those two things together. Just a last thought for me as we just close out the evening, if that's all right. And I was just thinking of a guy who once said to me, he said, do you think we can really know God? And I responded quickly to him. I said, yeah, sure. And he wasn't satisfied. He came back, he said, no. He said, do you think we can really know God? And I realized that he was asking me a deeper question. He wasn't just asking me about whether we can know about God, whether we can know God philosophically, scientifically, historically. He was asking whether we could know God in a deeper way, whether we can know God in some sort of personal way, in some sort of relational way. And that's a significant question. And G.K. Chesterton actually said, there's 2 ways to try on a coat. There's 2 ways to see if a coat fits you. He said you can look at all the measurements and see if the measurements line up with your size, and that's one way to know whether a coat fits you. He said, or you could try the coat on. Now, I think both are important. I never would have tried on the coat of faith unless I had been able to look at the measurements, of philosophy and history and science, and say, yeah, that's in the vicinity of something that would fit. But at the end of the day, because Christianity claims that God is personal, then at some point there is that point of actually trying it on. And when that happens, you step into a deeper knowledge of God than just what can be known by the intellect, just what can be known propositionally. There was a guy who, on another college campus, I had the privilege of journeying with for a week, and towards the end of that week, he had looked at the measurements. He had seen that they were in the vicinity of rationality. And he said, actually, I think I'm ready to try this in a more personal way. He bowed his head, he prayed to God. He just prayed a very simple but an authentic prayer, just telling God where he was at and that he wanted to take a step of beginning to trust in him. And then he opened his eyes, and I always remember these were the very first words out of his mouth after he opened his eyes. He said, I've always felt alone and like I had to wear a mask. But now this is the first time in my life that I can take off that mask and be fully myself. and fully alive. Incredible transition in his heart that took place when he didn't just think about God intellectually, but he was willing to take a relational step of trust towards him as well. And for each person in the room, for each one of us, it's going to be very different. He was saying that I'm alone and I need to take off a mask. For some of us, it might be very, very different what that deep longing of the heart is. But if there's a God who created you, he's going to want you to know him in a full way. Yes, that's going to include your mind, but that's also going to include your heart as well. And the reality in any relationship is that most of your knowledge of the person actually comes after you take a relational step of trust towards them, not beforehand. Same thing with my wife, Jill. I knew enough about her beforehand to say this is a good decision, to say that I want to spend more time with you, but ultimately it wasn't until I took a relational step of trust towards her that I really got to know her in a deep way. So I'm just going to end, if it's all right, just for a minute. I'm going to pray a prayer of just taking a relational step of trust further towards God. For each person in the room, that might mean something radically different. For some of you, that might mean I've been a person that has followed God for 20 years, but I still want to know you more, God. For some people, that's going to mean I'm somewhere in between. For some of you, it's going to mean I have no idea whether this is true, or I don't even think this is true. But maybe you want to pray a prayer like I prayed when I was a freshman in college, and I just said, God, I don't know if I'm talking to anyone, but if I am, I'd really like to know about it. I think God loves that sort of prayer too, and he honors it. So let me just say a short prayer in that regard, and just make of this whatever is right for you in this moment. So God, I'm just thankful to you that we could be here tonight, that we could be here together, that we could think about important things, Lord, in a world that's often just so fast-paced and so distracted, and just spending so much time on Xbox, Lord, and I like Xbox as much as the next guy. But I'm thankful, Lord, that tonight we got to deal with some deep, fundamental questions of life, the questions that give meaning to life. And just here in this moment, I just want to say personally to you, God, I've known you for a while. I've been thankful to know not just about you, but to know you in a personal way, and to see a transformation in my own heart because of that. But I just want to say tonight, I want to take a step closer to you, a step of relational trust, or that I would rely on you more fully. I would put my trust in you more fully, and that through that, Lord, you would give me greater dreams for what this life could be, greater dreams for what there could be beyond this life, Lord, that you would make me more of the person that you created me to be. That's my hope. And Lord, I ask that for each person in this room as well, whatever that means in their own life. Lord, I ask a blessing on every person right now that's just saying, yes, God, I want to take that step, whether it's a small step or a big step, of relational step, a relational trust towards you. And God, I pray that as people take those steps, even tonight, even as they put their head on the pillow to go to sleep, they would just have that sense of your presence, and not only your presence, Lord, but that love that you have for them, that love that we spoke about tonight, that love which is completely unconditional and cannot be earned and cannot be lost. I pray that a knowledge of that love from you would give them a deep, deep peace in their hearts, and that would be lasting and true for them. And we trust you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
That was so good. Thank you, guys. Wow.
Yeah, so we want to quickly do our final announcements. One thing is we didn't really have a lot of time to go through all that Q&A, and I saw a lot of other questions on there. I'm sure you guys have a lot more questions. So to kind of solve that, the people on this side of the rows, at the end of the row, we have these are our connection cards. You may or may not know what we do with them. Number one, we fill them out with like our contact information, name, right? And this is how we can, again, get you guys connected, right? And someone will be able to reach out to you. But more specifically for tonight, if you want to write down any question that you had that was unanswered on the back, right? We'll be sending out answers to those questions, and we'll help investigate them for you and hopefully send you an answer to either your phone number or your email that you put on there. So if you guys can take that from the end of the row and then pass them down. Number two.